Welcome to the HR Spoonfuls podcast, brought to you by Andera HR, the home of helpdesk4hr.com and AI for HRhub.com, where you can find assistance from qualified human resources professionals and learn about all things related to the use of artificial intelligence solutions for your HR department. Now listen in as your AI-driven hosts, Alex and Ivy, discuss interesting and current human resources topics, one spoonful at a time.
Okay, ready for a deep dive into something I think we all hope we never have to actually use.
I'm ready.
Today, it's all about workplace violence. We've got crisismanagement.pdf to guide us, and let me tell you, this goes way beyond the typical be prepared stuff.
You know, what strikes me about this manual is how it really gets into the psychology of these situations. It's not just about, reacting after the fact, but really understanding the why.
Yeah, and it's way more prevalent than we'd like to think.
Yeah.
Like right off the bat, this manual hits you with a pretty scary stat. Homicide. It's a leading cause of workplace death. Not exactly
Light reading.
No, not at all. Definitely makes you want to pay attention.
Definitely. And it really dispels that myth that it can't happen here, because this manual makes it very clear it can happen anywhere. So, myth-busting time. Crisismanagement.pdf takes on a bunch of these comforting lies we tell ourselves. Take the idea that violence just comes out of nowhere.
Right, like a light switch.
Exactly.
This manual shuts that down right away. It emphasizes that it's almost never a sudden thing. It's a progression. And it usually starts with these, subtle signs. Things we might just disregard completely if we don't know what we're looking for.
And that's where crisismanagement.pdf gets super practical. It lays out these stages of escalation, starting with disruptive behavior, but get this, it gives concrete examples.
Yeah, it's not just these vague descriptions.
Yeah.
And that's where, at least for me, the aha moments hit. I mean, we might think disruptive behavior, that's just someone being loud or opinionated maybe. But this manual, it gets way more nuanced. Oh, for sure. It really made me realize just how oblivious I could be to some of this stuff. We're talking like withdrawing from interaction, not respecting authority, even getting weirdly aggressive with objects.
Oh, yeah, totally. Think about the classic Office Space printer scene, right? Funny in a movie, but this manual highlights that kind of thing. Damaging property could be a red flag.
So the takeaway, don't just brush off those subtle changes. Pay attention to patterns. Now, we're not saying become the office gossip, but...
Right. It's about knowing what to do with these observations. And that's where the manual introduces this notice, discuss, report framework. It's designed to help navigate these tricky situations.
Okay, so we've talked about noticing. Let's dig into discuss. What does that look like in practice?
So this is where you might actually have a direct conversation with the person, particularly if you're noticing those behaviors that seem relatively minor. It's not about confrontation, but rather just expressing concern, maybe even offering support.
So you see a coworker withdrawing. You might check in on them, ask how they're doing.
Exactly. And the manual is good about this. It suggests approaching these conversations with empathy, focusing on specific things you've noticed, rather than being judgmental.
So instead of saying, hey, you seem angry, you might say, hey, I've noticed you seem a bit quieter than usual. Is everything okay?
Exactly. Just creating that space where they feel safe to talk, not attacked or judged. And remembering you're not there to diagnose or fix their problems.
Right, just listen and offer support. But what if the situation seems more serious? Or if you're just not comfortable bringing it up directly?
That's where that report stage comes in.
And crisismanagement.pdf seems pretty clear on this. Trying to be the hero can really backfire. So who do you report to?
Your safety and everyone else's, that comes first. Report to your supervisor, HR, your company's EAP, even a tip line if they have one.
It's about using those resources, not trying to handle it all on your own.
Right. It's not about being right. It's about staying safe. And that early intervention, that's key. Because things rarely just magically resolve themselves.
We've talked about early warning signs, but what about those triggers that can take a situation from tense to critical? Crisismanagement.pdf gets really real about those.
It does. It lays out three main categories. Situations that feel unfair, situations that get too personal, and situations that feel like they're spiraling out of control.
And within each category, they give these really specific examples, stuff you might not even think of as potentially dangerous.
Absolutely. One that stood out to me was how even small reprimands, criticisms from a supervisor, those can be major triggers, especially if someone's already feeling vulnerable.
It's all about perception. What might seem like constructive feedback to one person could feel like a personal attack to someone else, especially if they're dealing with other stressors outside of work.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of which, the manual talks about how domestic violence situations can spill over into the workplace.
Right, and this is where those subtle signs we talked about before become even more important. Disruptive phone calls from a partner, unexplained bruises, sudden changes in how they dress.
Difficulty concentrating, maybe even being absent more often because they're trying to deal with a tough situation at home. It's rough.
And it emphasizes responding with compassion, recognizing they might be in a really tough spot and helping connect them with resources. So it's not just about seeing potential aggression, but also recognizing when someone's vulnerable and needs support.
Exactly. And another trigger the manual highlights, financial strain. And it's not just about the person who's going through it. It can create this ripple effect in the whole workplace, impacting morale, how productive people are.
Even causing resentment and conflict between coworkers.
Absolutely. And then something we don't always connect with workplace violence grief, but the manual makes a good point. Losing a loved one can really throw someone off balance.
And that grief can show up in unexpected ways, including anger and even aggression.
The manual really encourages us to be mindful of that, especially since so many people experience loss and are just expected to keep working like nothing's changed.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And the manual doesn't pretend it's simple. It acknowledges that these situations are messy. There's no one right answer. But it gives us this framework for understanding what's happening and empowers us to actually do something.
And that leads us to another trigger that really got to me. Perceived slights.
Yeah.
It's so subjective. Like the manual even uses the example of someone bumping into you in the hallway. Could that really be enough to set someone off?
Right. It's not so much about the actual event, but how it's perceived. And the manual points out that if someone is already feeling persecuted or marginalized, even something small could feel like a deliberate attack.
So it's not just about what happens, but also how it's filtered through that person's experiences, their anxieties, all of that.
Precisely. And this is where that emphasis on empathy comes in again. We've got to remember that everyone's carrying their own baggage, their own triggers, and what might seem insignificant to us could be a huge deal to someone else.
That's a powerful point. So we're talking about a spectrum here, right? On one end, just your average workplace disagreements, and then
a tipping point where those disagreements become something more serious. The manual talks about these conflict dangers, recognizing when a conflict is becoming potentially volatile.
Yeah, and that's where the manual brings up this idea of an action point. That moment when you realize, okay, this is different. This isn't just a disagreement. This could actually get dangerous if someone doesn't intervene.
So it's not just about recognizing that violence is possible in the workplace, but identifying that specific moment when it feels like a real possibility, which feels like a really tough call to make. It is. And the manual doesn't shy away from that, but it also says you don't have to have all the answers right then and there. The important thing is to have a plan for what to do when you hit that action point.
Which brings us back to that report, part of the framework we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the best thing you can do is realize it's bigger than you and bring in someone who's actually trained for these situations.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to actually know what your company's policies are, what the procedures are, who are you supposed to call, what information do they need. The manual emphasizes that being ready for that moment can actually literally save lives.
It's like a fire drill, but for dangerous situations.
Yeah.
You may never have to use it, but if you do, you'll be glad you practiced.
Yes. And speaking of practice, the manual is a big proponent of not just knowing the company's emergency procedures, but actually rehearsing them regularly.
So those fire drills, active shooter drills, those aren't just inconveniences. They're actually super important to build up that muscle memory so you can react well under pressure.
Yep. Crisismanagement.pdf really stresses that. It even says you should be familiar with stuff like escape routes, where you're supposed to go so you aren't trying to figure it out during a crisis.
It's like the difference between reading about how to swim and actually getting in the water. Nothing beats actually going through the motions in a hopefully safe environment.
Absolutely. And that kind of preparation goes beyond just the physical stuff. The manual also talks about being mentally prepared.
So what does that look like? How do you prepare your mind for something that could be really unpredictable and traumatic, like workplace violence?
There's this thing called mental rehearsal, which is basically just picturing different scenarios and how you would respond.
So you're basically walking through situations in your mind. Maybe someone's getting really worked up in a meeting, or maybe it's a domestic dispute that spills over into the office, and you're thinking about what you would do, how you would keep yourself and others safe.
Exactly. And the manual is clear that this isn't about being able to predict the future or having a perfect response to everything. It's about building your capacity to stay calm, think straight, and remember those emergency procedures we talked about, even if you're stressed out.
It's about going from a place of fear and reacting to being aware and taking action. And that mental preparedness, that's valuable everywhere, not just at work, but anywhere you might have conflict or crisis.
Totally. And this brings us to another interesting thing from crisismanagement.pdf. It doesn't just focus on the individual, it also talks about what the organization needs to do to create a culture of safety.
So it's not all on the employee to be on guard and ready. It's about the company creating a space where people feel like they can speak up, they can report concerns, and where safety is a priority.
Exactly. It really stresses that if you want to be proactive about preventing workplace violence, everybody needs to be on board, from the CEO to the new person.
So what are some ways companies can actually do that, build that kind of culture?
They get into it in the manual. It's really helpful. It talks about stuff like having clear policies against violence and harassment, giving regular training to everyone on recognizing warning signs and what to do, and making sure there are confidential ways for people to report stuff without being afraid of retaliation.
So making it crystal clear that safety is a big deal and that everyone plays a part.
Yes. And realizing that dealing with workplace violence isn't just about avoiding people getting hurt, it's about making sure everybody feels safe, respected, supported, all of it.
And that's got to be good for business too, right? If people feel safe and supported at work, they're more likely to be engaged with their work, more productive.
There's actually data on this, which they mention in the manual. Companies with strong safety cultures tend to have lower turnover, their employees are happier, and even customer satisfaction goes up.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Putting in the work to be proactive about safety, it pays off in a lot of ways.
Big time. And investing in your people, that's one of the most important things a company can do.
What do you mean by that?
The manual talks about how important it is to create a space where people feel okay talking about this stuff, where they can get help if they need it for themselves or a coworker.
So it's not enough to have the rules, people have to feel comfortable actually using them.
Exactly. And that takes open communication, trust, and a genuine commitment to making sure everyone's okay.
It sounds like crisismanagement.pdf wants us to totally rethink how we see workplace safety. It's not just about avoiding accidents or knowing what to do if something happens. It's about creating a whole environment that's all about proactive care and prevention.
Right. And that change starts with being aware, which is what this whole deep dive is about. By understanding how workplace violence works, being able to spot the warning signs, and knowing what to do, we can make things safer and more supportive for everybody.
Well said. Now, before we wrap things up, let's go back to that action point idea. The manual lays out some very specific steps you can take when you reach that point, and I think it's worth going over those in a bit more detail.
Definitely. Those steps are a big part of what makes this manual so helpful. They can make all the difference in a risky situation.
Okay, let's say you've noticed some red flags. You've tried talking to the person, but nothing's changing, or it's even getting worse, and you don't feel comfortable bringing it up directly anymore. What do you do?
This is where that report stage we talked about before comes in.
And the manual's really clear that reporting isn't about being a snitch or getting anyone in trouble. It's about getting the right people involved so the situation can de-escalate and doesn't get even worse.
Exactly. Safety comes first, even if it's uncomfortable to report something.
So who are you supposed to report to?
The manual lists a few options: your supervisor, HR, your company's employee assistance program, or even a tip line. The most important thing is to go with whatever you feel good about, whichever one makes you feel like your concerns will be taken seriously.
The manual says it's not about being right, it's about being safe.
Exactly. The goal is to keep everyone safe, and that takes everyone working together. Speaking up, even if it feels weird, is part of that.
It's like that see something, say something idea, right?
Yeah.
But the manual actually gives you a framework for how to do it and who to talk to.
And it also says it's super important to write things down, your observations, anything you do, even if it was just a conversation with a coworker.
That documentation can be really important later on if things escalate. It's a record of what happened and when.
Exactly. And it can help you spot patterns that you might not have seen before.
It's all about connecting the dots, those little signs that you might have missed otherwise.
Yeah. And that's the heart of this whole manual. It gives you the tools and the framework to not just react to violence in the workplace, but actually do something about it, to try and stop it from happening.
That's a really powerful idea, and I think it's something we can all get behind.
Yeah, it really does feel like Crisismanagement.pdf is saying, hey, let's stop just reacting to this stuff and actually try to prevent it. It's a whole different way of looking at things. Instead of what do we do if this happens, it's what can we do so it doesn't happen in the first place.
And to do that, you need everyone on board, each person, the whole company being aware and ready. We've talked about a lot today, recognizing those little warning signs, understanding what can escalate a situation into a crisis. But for someone listening who's thinking, this is all good, but what do I actually DO? What are, like, the top 3 things they should take away from crisismanagement.pdf?
They actually address that in the manual, which is cool. It comes down to this. Notice, discuss, report, and know your resources. We've talked about them, but they're worth repeating.
Okay, so break those down for us one more time. Notice. That's about picking up on those little changes in behavior, those red flags that might mean someone's having a tough time or getting agitated.
Yeah, don't ignore those gut feelings. If something feels off, it probably is. Pay attention and trust your instincts.
Okay, then there's discuss. Having those conversations with coworkers, that can be hard, but so important when you see something concerning.
Right, and come at it from a place of caring, focusing on what you've actually noticed, not judging.
Yeah.
And remember, you're not there to fix their problems, but you can let them know you're there for them.
And if it feels really serious, or you just don't feel comfortable saying something to them directly, that's where report comes in.
Exactly. Report it to your supervisors, someone in HR, whoever is supposed to handle these situations in your company.
Crisismanagement.pdf is really strong on this point. Keeping yourself safe and keeping other people safe, that's what matters most. Don't wait to speak up if you need to.
Absolutely. And last but not least, know your resources. Make sure you actually know your company's policies, what to do if something happens, all of that.
It's like having those tools ready to go, even if you really, really hope you'll never need them.
Exactly. And we all have a part to play in making our workplaces safer. Be aware, be proactive, and look out for each other.
That's a great place to wrap up, I think. This deep dive into crisismanagement.pdf has really been eye-opening. We've had a lot to think about, but more importantly, we've gotten a framework for action, for going from just knowing about this stuff to actually being prepared.
And that's what makes this manual so great. It's not just about understanding the problem. It's about giving people the tools to do something about it, to make things safer, both at work and everywhere else.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. Think about the places where you spend your time, work, your community, your home. What can you do, starting today, to make those places safer for yourself and the people around you?
Thanks for listening to HR Spoonfuls. For more episodes like this one, drop by helpdeskforhr.com or AIforHRhub.com and subscribe to our newsletter to receive HR updates and notices when new podcast episodes are posted. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and will join us again soon.